Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Well, hello. You may be wondering what happened to Joseph. He looks a little different today. No, Joseph couldn't join us this morning. He was feeling a little under the weather, but we are so delighted to have our colleague, John White, with us here today. John and I were in training together, and I think the first time I met you, we wound up going to dinner together, and I laughed so hard my stomach hurt. So yeah, it's just always so fun to be with you, John. And I've been wanting to get you on the podcast, and there's so many things, honestly, that we could talk about with John. But today we asked him to come on to talk about Stoicism. So we're interested in the connection between Stoicism and psychoanalysis, between Stoicism and Jung, and also between Stoicism and just, living a good life now. So John White is a Jungian psychoanalyst and mental health counselor in private practice in Pittsburgh, PA. He is the coordinator of the C.G. Jung Institute Analyst Training Program in Pittsburgh and president-elect of the board of the Pittsburgh Psychoanalytic Center. Besides his work as a psychotherapist and training analyst, he has a doctorate in philosophy and is a scholar in residence at the Simon Silverman Phenomenology Center at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. Among his recent publications are the book Adaptation and Psychotherapy, Langs and Analytical Psychology, which I'm really looking forward to reading. He has a recent co-edited book with our colleague Laura Tuley, Jungian Analysis in the World on Fire at the Nexus of Individual and Collective Trauma, and an article entitled Colonizing the American Psyche, Virtue and the Problem of Consumer Capitalism in Critical Theory and Psychoanalysis, among many other publications. And he's a wonderful speaker and teacher and just a really fun guy. So I think you're going to enjoy this.
Thank you.
Welcome, John. When Lisa mentioned, we should do an episode on Stoicism, my reaction was, what?
On purpose?
Right. And then Lisa said, it's really out there. People are talking about it. It's in the collective. And so I said, well then, okay, let's get interested in it and let's go. And so here you are to help us understand not only Stoicism, but what on earth might we make of what's going on in the collective, that there's a resurgent interest in this now.
Yes, I think there's the potential that it's compensatory, but we'll get to that in a minute. John, why don't you just start off by telling us, we told John as we were prepping, we're like, we're going to let you carry this because you're the philosopher. God damn it. You probably taught undergraduate courses on Stoicism. So Deb and I did a little prep, but tell us what Stoicism is. Give us just a taste of the history.
I wonder if as a starting point, it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about what I would call the ancient discovery of reason, because reason is so important, obviously, for Stoicism. And while in our time we use the word reason like it's straightforward and we know what it means and that sort of thing, one of the interesting things about the ancient world that we're entering into here for a few minutes is that the discovery of reason is actually something could be attributed to it. In other words, rationality is a faculty we have, and we could understand it that way. But philosophy only begins when rationality becomes conscious of itself. So it's not just that somebody has been rational in this situation or not. It's rather the recognition that rationality is of value and something that could actually guide one's life. Now, that's really important because I think when people talk about philosophy Very often they've had an intro to philosophy class in college or something like this. And when you have that class, you're going to have this idea that, I don't know, that, some philosopher pulled some question out of his ass and then they answered it. And, then they produced this thing and you have just a kind of a piecemeal sense of it without understanding the basic experience that produced philosophy in the first place. It's really rationality becoming conscious of itself as valuable and important. Okay, and why did that come up is also key here for understanding Stoicism, I think. And that is that in the age that we're talking about, particularly the age of Plato, then Aristotle, and then Stoicism, you have a consistent regression, you might say, going on in Greek Hellenic culture, or at least the feeling that that's going on. The loss of a sense of the polis, of the community that's bound up with the organization of the cities and their particular traditions. And that loss felt like it was a loss that wasn't being replaced by anything else. Now, why is that important? And this, again, it plays into our understanding of Stoicism, is that the act of rationality becoming conscious of itself was also a resistance to political and social disorder. If there had not been that political and social disorder, it's a real question whether that act of philosophizing would have happened. It was the idea that a civilization, a culture, didn't have its own resources anymore to satisfy, and also to survive whatever crises were going on. That seems to have produced an activity whereby one tries to take another perspective on what's happening, and as it were, tries to rise above the crisis of history to find another view on it. So again, it's one of those things that, you wouldn't get that from a philosophy book necessarily. So I think it's kind of crucial to understand it. But you actually see it in the letters of Plato. You see it in even the symbols, particularly that Plato uses. So when he writes his masterpiece, The Republic, the symbols he uses is the difference between a healthy and diseased city, which he says the soul is written in large letters in the city. So the point here is that it's not just saying, oh, this city's not functioning well. The symbol of health and disease, something that, of course, as psychotherapists we take very seriously, that's actually said about the society and about the soul. What Plato already recognized was that the corruption of the city means that there's already a corruption of the soul, and the kind of person who's being produced by the city is an indication of how corrupt both the system and the souls are. So this movement toward understanding from a rational point of view, a point of view from above, what's going on here, it's pulling one out of one's criteria, what's going on in the collective, and saying, actually, we can begin to judge the collective from another and higher point of view. So you see why that might be important for understanding rationality and why this is so important for the inception of philosophy, which also, even though I've only talked about Plato, it certainly works itself into Stoicism.
It also sounds like implicit in this is the differentiation of the individual from the society. That if you can pull back and think about thinking and differentiate also from the society that is, difficult and not satisfying, is it also the birthplace of individual kind of locus of control?
Yeah, it's certainly that, and it also has its compensatory side as well, right? So Plato and Aristotle were more trying to save the polis in some way. The Stoics, who come a little later, the polis is already kind of lost. With Alexander, spread of the empire and the spread of Hellenism, all of which was deemed generally a good thing, but which nonetheless broke down the kinds of more interpersonal, familial relationships and so forth that were characteristic of the polis. One had to find a new way of relating to others. So on the one hand, you're right, Stoicism begins kind of with the idea that of a sort of dependency on one's own reason, one's responsibility for one's inner life, to be rational and reasonable in what one does. So in a way, there's a kind of an articulation of individualism in the sense that one is no longer interpreted simply as a member of the polis. On the other hand, though, there's also a universalism. And that's one of the interesting things about Stoicism. It moves away from a more aristocratic idea. The old visions of virtue, for example, which are so important in ancient philosophy and in ethics throughout the Western tradition. Virtues always has a somewhat aristocratic dimension to them that, if you had education and culture, you could actually also become a virtuous person, but maybe not everybody could do that. Stoicism changes that. It's just everybody is responsible for that, and everybody can, in principle, become that. So it's both individualistic and universalistic at the same time.
Yeah, which I think it has in common actually with the psychoanalysis in general, but certainly with Jung, the sense that the idea of universality being so central, that what we're talking about is something that can at least theoretically be accessed by anyone.
That's right. When one talks about Stoicism, it's often in terms of a kind of cosmopolitanism. So one is no longer simply experiencing oneself as part of one's own traditions out of which one comes, but that there's a universality, a sense maybe of a common human nature, even that's maybe more important than those traditions. So that's right. And as you say, certainly within a psychoanalytic tradition, the idea is that we all need to be responsible for our inner life, and all of us can, in principle, be responsible for it.
So reason then is this faculty of kind of thinking, becoming aware of itself. And it's, for the purpose of perspective taking and perhaps meaning making.
Well, that's right. And in fact, this is, I don't know how much we want to go into this, but this is worth sort of understanding, is that when I said that reason becomes sort of conscious of itself, the reason why I can say that is because Plato wrote on that and Aristotle wrote on that. They actually talk about these experiences, and they imply at least that they're experiences they understand to be new in some level, that there is this other point of view. And this is really interesting. This is where the Stoics could, you might say they may have lost something, even though they also gained certain things in this. When Plato talks about reason, this is one of these ways where a contemporary understanding of reason is really quite different. Plato understands it. He uses the Greek word nous, that's N-O-U-S, so it's not a rope around your neck. Plato introduces this or articulates the notion of nous. It's not simply reason like the capacity to use logic and apply it, which is really what we mostly mean by reason nowadays. It actually has more of a mystical component to it. In the act of nous, one rises above, one might say, one's normal pragmatic relationship to the world and begins to understand things according to their nature. So you try to understand what they are, not only what their function for your life is, but what they are themselves. Plato thinks there's a kind of, I sort of want to call it a sense for the cosmos that happens, that one is illuminated. He uses light symbols all the time. It's not only reason being conscious of itself, it's also sort of reason being luminous to itself. It understands itself as having a place in the cosmos and understanding something about the structures of the cosmos. And he does call it luminosity. And in fact, throughout the philosophical tradition, it was often called illumination. In philosophical texts, they often just call it the illumination theory of knowledge. I don't really like that because it's not really so much a theory, it's an articulation of an experience. But the experience then of reason, this is what I mean by say, kind of takes you above the historical contingencies of your times, try to understand the nature of things, and then try to understand how those are brought to bear on reality. So the nous is an experience. Logos, which is the other word for reason, is more like logic, articulation, how to apply it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the Stoics have a real emphasis. But they sort of gave up the experience of nous. They didn't so much understand the idea that the human psyche participates in kind of a divine order on the basis of which then one uses logic. On that, they were much more skeptical. Skeptical is maybe too strong a word, but I think that they didn't do what Plato calls in his Phaedo, the second voyage. What Plato means by that is that he not only articulates an understanding of the world, but tries to understand that there are supersensible causes for why the world is the way that it is. Stoicism kind of gave up some of that mystical element and instead just focused on something kind of like what Plato was talking about, but they didn't really think that there was this mystical element. It really had to do with understanding how the cosmos has a kind of rationality, and you do participate in it, but it's not so much in a mystical participation.
If you've been thinking about joining Dream School, now is the time. We're offering 10% off until December 31st. Dream School is a unique online course that offers you access to the inner world of knowing, possibility, and imagination. Presented by the three of us, this year-long program provides the space, knowledge, and guidance that lets you reach within and access the secrets of the inner self that appears each night in your dreams. It's an affirming community of fellow travelers, each on an individual inner adventure. Join us in an adventure to wholeness through understanding your dreams, the little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of soul.
So, in a way, it feels like this kind of concept of reason and objectivity, and all the virtues. I was reading the new translation of Meditations, originally written by Marcus Aurelius, and it feels very sort of moralistic. All these lessons of, don't feel envy, greed, jealousy. Get up in the morning.
Make your bed.
Make your bed, eat right. But something missing of if we could do all those things, we would. But really sort of a veneration of ego. Today we would call ego, of your thinking function. And just do the right thing all day, every day. That's it. If only we could.
I just wanted to point out that much of what we think of nowadays as psychotherapy was really done in philosophical communities in ancient worlds. Because the idea was that wisdom seeking is always simultaneously about the cosmos, but it's also about the soul, right? So there's always this kind of working idea that we're a microcosm as human beings. So the more we understand ourselves, the more we understand the cosmos, the more we understand the cosmos, the more we understand ourselves. So even if there was a philosophy of nature that's also shedding light on our inner life and our inner life on the cosmos at the same time. So much bringing order to the psyche, you could say then, is done in a moralistic way because trying to formulate it as something that one should do. But a lot of it is a kind of psychological wisdom at the same time. It's very practical wisdom, but it's nonetheless a kind of psychological wisdom. So in a way, what we do was internal to the philosophical communities in the ancient world.
So if it's okay, let's just, because I want to kind of bring us up to the present day. So you started with Plato. Can you just give us a whistle-stop tour? These ideas started in Greece. How did they migrate? Because they've Stoicism has either existed or has been very influential in many different wisdom traditions up to today.
All right. So just sort of quickly then, Stoicism really begins right after Alexander forms the empire. So it's not so much Athenian as much as Hellenic, right? So it's about it's already you have empire that's at work. And so with the empire, there's of course the spread of ideas, that's going on much more even than there had been previously, even though that's going on. So it's really in the Hellenic period that Stoicism becomes very widespread. It does this function that we've already talked about. It kind of gives people common guidance for life. Oftentimes, figures who are part of it were very good at doing kind of aphorisms. Marcus Aurelius, of course, is outstanding at giving very brief, pithy statements of things. But that's in a way kind of endemic to Stoicism. And that early Stoicism always had this focus on ethics. That was very much, right from the start, central to Stoicism. As the Hellenic period kind of moves to what we call the Roman imperial period, you also have kind of the rebirth of the schools. Once the Roman Empire brings a certain amount of peace, then of course you have the possibility for some of these schools to flourish once again. You have the possibility of kind of a new setting in Rome and throughout the Roman Empire. And various of these traditions take root. Stoicism is very strong. By the time that the kind of Roman Republic is flourishing, philosophy is an inherent part of education. So people have some kind of knowledge of what's going on philosophically. Stoicism was not so much an independent school in some ways as being part of an eclectic mix. That was often the case. So Cicero, for example, the great orator, was had a strong Stoic influence, but he'd also read Plato and other figures as well, and gives us very specifically Roman element to that. And of course, the Roman of the time, of course, were as a rule very practical people anyway. The speculative philosophy was not a strong suit. You might say speculative religion was not a strong suit. We're taught in elementary school that the Roman gods are just the Greek gods and other name, and that's some extent that's true. In some ways, it's not. Like, for example, Ares in Greek was the madness of war, but Mars in Rome, a very disciplined soldier, of course, because he's representing the virtues of the Romans. So the Romans were very much practical people, which is not to say they didn't have strong religious and also had their own kind of version of a kind of mysticism, but it's not a speculative philosophical mysticism. So Stoicism found a natural home there, I would say. So it's not surprising even that one of their emperors was very clearly, Stoic. Now, due to the so-called Dark Ages, of course, there isn't much access to those traditions in Western Europe, and they only really begin to reemerge actually through Islam.
Interesting. I didn't realize that.
The preservation of many of the Greek and even to some extent the Roman texts go through Byzantium, and then they go through Islam. And then as Islam crosses northern Africa and goes into the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal are now, then you had this mix of kind of Jewish mysticism, Islamic thought, that some of it was Neoplatonic, some of it was Aristotelian, and there was at least some awareness of Stoicism as well. There's also very much Jewish thought. Kabbalah becomes kind of articulated in there too. And so it's interesting that it's actually what's now Spain and Portugal, a region that was extremely fruitful in various traditions and accepted that up until 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella, insisted on being a Catholic country and all of that sort of thing. Prior to that, there'd been a lot of interaction. So many ideas of that kind of come into Italy and into the educated part throughout Europe. But Stoicism, so far as I know, comes back with more interest in the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, when there's a strong recovery of ancient texts, as the Eastern Empire's falling under the force of Islam coming west, many of the texts that were preserved in that part of Europe then also come to Western Europe. And I think it's really at this time that just a general interest both in Roman and Greek history and kind of recovering literary texts and so forth, that Stoicism comes back. Now, elements of Stoicism are still there even in the Middle Ages. If we get to a point where we're talking about the theory of the natural law, for example, it's very important for medieval scholasticism. That's largely borrowed from Stoicism. But I think as far as becoming kind of flourishing as an ethical system, it's really post-Renaissance. And this is where it's one of the places where it actually influences the United States, not necessarily in an entirely good way, is that the recovery of Stoicism, one place where Stoicism became pretty popular was actually in Puritanism.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, our Puritan founding is, I think, very much a shadow that still is very much very influential at a deep stratum.
Yes.
And I think, looking at it as the Jungian, of course, also in a non-geodromic way, right? It's because you have puritanical repression, or else you have kind of, wild promiscuity and kind of a pleasure-based thing, right? They're two sides of the same coin. So once you understand that Puritanism kind of represents one side of a complex, you can also understand that the other side, which might be more rampant in some ways, but that these opposites seem to need each other. So Puritanism found Stoicism a great help, because one of the characteristics of Puritanism is, I don't know how to put it, but it hates wildness.
All those fun-loving pilgrims.
Well, that first Thanksgiving, they did party for 3 days, but after that, I don't know what happened. So, you can say hate wildness, or you can say love of order. It depends on how you want to view it. Certainly, it's viewed as a love of order, and that is one of the things that impels the Puritans so quickly, for example, to spread throughout New England, and found the Boston Latin School and found Harvard, and there's just this incredible. They're only there 6 years, right, and they founded Harvard already, right? So there's this incredible energy in that. And a lot of that comes from a vision of rational control. So that's maybe the positive part of that. But the shadow part of it, of course, is, kind of tends to be antibody, tends to be very suspicious of emotions, of instincts, and of course is equally devastating to the environment. Because if you think that your own relationship to animal nature has to be suppressed, chances are you're not too keen on nature generally.
So one of the main precepts of Stoicism then is really sort of like we can control ourselves, and should. We should control our emotions. We should rein in our impulses. We should check our instincts. Am I getting it?
Yes, I think that's right. And there are variations of degree, but I think that that's very much a part of it. And that's always the idea that somehow instinctual life, to a lesser extent, but still also emotional life, will throw off this rational self-control.
It's a real polarity, kind of a split, a real valuing of ego and decision-making, as if the rest of us isn't there anyway.
Yeah. Or is so problematic that you can't do much with it. That's not just an old Stoic influence. That's still present day, isn't it? I mean, there's still an idea, for example, and I mean, I've always noticed this in American culture, that because feelings and strong affects can lead us astray, there's the strange inference that affectivity itself must be a problem. I mean, volitions also lead us astray, but nobody thinks the will is a problem. Reasoning also leads us astray sometimes, but nobody thinks reason itself is the problem. But for some reason, emotional life, affective life, because it can somehow lead you astray, and somehow it's as if the affective life itself is the problem. So if you're objective, you leave emotional life out of it.
I'm going back to what you said about the origins in a time of disorder, of that Stoicism comes along to say, there is order, we can make order, we will be in order, as a kind of way of staving off almost an apotropaic compensatory reaction to disorder, of we will order into being.
Right. It moves in that direction. And with that, it has, the kind of, again, looking at it as a Jungian, it has this peculiar problem that feeling function is actually where you get values.
Uh-oh.
So if you think getting a moral compass is important, in a way, having a cultivated, and notice I'm not saying the feeling function is just fine the way it is. I would agree with the Stoics. It needs to be cultivated in a certain way, and just letting it run amok is not a good thing. But the Stoics seem to give the impression that it must run amok, rather than it can be cultivated, which is something, someone would be more Aristotelian and Platonic to say that, no, you can actually do something with this part of your being. It doesn't have to just kind of run amok. And so Stoicism seems to suspect that. So it makes sense that I think on a Stoic model that you'd be worried about feeling life precisely because it does have to do with values. There's value confusion when there's chaos, but instead of saying, maybe that's telling me something about value confusion, instead, well, just suppress that and be reasonable, be rational.
One of the things that you said a minute ago that I think is important, that I like about Stoicism, and that I wonder if this is why people are so drawn to it, is you use the word cultivation. And I feel like this is something that in our current moment, and maybe it's been true for a while, I don't know, but there is no sense that it's on us to cultivate ourselves, to cultivate the intellect, to cultivate our virtue, to cultivate sort of being better. It does strike me that is kind of a Stoic value, that one works on oneself, one tries to be a better person. And, I know individuals like that who, okay, how can I be a better friend? How can I be a better partner? How can I be a better husband? How can I improve my mind? But in general, I don't think there's a lot of that in the culture. It's more like, this is me. This is who I am. What I'm lobbying the rest of the culture for is acceptance for who I am. I don't need to change. So I find that kind of principle, or that value, that tendency in Stoicism to be something that maybe is very potentially valuable, that we might want to take on. So I don't know if you've thoughts about that.
I am just what I am. It's sort of a Popeye psychology. I am what I am. I know that that goes back before most people's time, I know. But anyway, the ancient Stoics, I think the ancient philosophers generally had the idea that personality is not the same as who I am. It's more how I am than what I am. It's the way I express myself. It's not identical with me. And that consequently, it can be cultivated and should be cultivated, because the personality is rather sets of potentials, some of which are strong, some of which are not. And, Jung's theory of typology hinges, of course, on that idea in some measure. But the old virtue theory entirely hinges on that as well, that it's not the personality I have, it's what I do with the personality that I have that's actually the important thing. And what makes me a substantive person is that I do something with it, not just simply that I am this.
You just mentioned, you called it the virtue. What did you call it? The virtue principle or
The old idea of virtue theory.
virtue theory. Is that part of Stoicism?
The older virtue theory that they could have inherited from Plato and Aristotle didn't focus simply on intellectual virtues, let's say, which is where Stoicism tends to focus. It focuses on the cultivation of intellect. And in its ethical principles, it tends to think that other things are unimportant compared to rationality. I think there's a bit of a more holistic picture that's more characteristic of sort of Plato and Aristotle, where there's also cultivation of intellectual virtues is, of course, crucial, but so is the so-called moral virtues, which really meant cultivation of instinctual and affective life. Because ultimately the idea is for all of these to serve a kind of a purpose, a life purpose, right? And of actually the people probably who developed this the most were the medieval theologians that a lot of philosophers don't look at very much, but Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, some of these great figures, they're very aware of the Stoic idea of law, of the Aristotelian conception of the cultivation of virtue, and used virtue, language and virtue, conceptions even to articulate their Christian faith, right? So faith, hope, and charity are understood as theological virtues because they're in need of the things you have to cultivate in yourself. Not just that you have them, is that you're consistently trying to expand their influence, right? And developing ways. They're almost like ranges of positive adaptation, you might say, is what virtue is. So it rather than
That's interesting. Wait. Say that again.
Yes, it's developing a range of positive adaptation.
Developing a range of positive adaptation. Wow.
And positive is not only positive for the environment, but it's positive for you because you become excellent through it. So the Greek word for virtue was arete, which really means excellence. You're basically saying, I have a human nature. That's what it is in general, but I also have the particularities, what we nowadays call personality. All of it needs to become excellent. That's what the goal is.
Well, I'm thinking about, first of all, I like how you tied it to adaptation, because of course, in some sense, that is one way to think about the goal of psychotherapy or even psychoanalysis. Some people might disagree with me on that, but we could have that conversation. And so I'm thinking about this again, going back to this idea of cultivation, and then how that fits into, for example, a psychoanalytic process.
Yeah.
Like, does the person come in and just get soothed? Oh, I'm so sorry your boss did that to you. Or is it that plus a sense of where are the places, where are the new possibilities?
Yes, lovely. That's exactly what I would say about that. And that's something that, though I certainly conceive of myself as a classical Jungian therapeutically, obviously philosophical sources are always influencing the way in which I'm using that. So what you're talking about, I think, is crucial. I've always felt that the kind of more traditional classical understanding of psychoanalysis, that it's really about insight, is true but partial. And that it is about how do we take that insight and make it into something where a person experiences themselves as expansive, right? So this virtue at the expansive is making excellent one's nature, looking at crises as opportunities more than simply crises, that, we can empathize with the crisis, but is there some seed in here, of whereby you are cultivating a part of yourself, that this challenge is, so to speak, the work of the self trying to have you have that challenge so that you will cultivate aspects of yourself that you might not do otherwise. It's always been a part of it for me. And I have felt at times that in analytic process, sometimes it's not that I in any way underrate the importance of insight. I just don't think that it's sufficient, especially if what you're trying to do is to help people become adaptive in a deeply maladaptive world.
That's kind of where I was heading too, is how do all these concepts relate to Jung's idea of becoming whole and individuated, to use the Jungian term, to take all these ideas that sound very sort of highfalutin around excellence. And I self-reflect, and then I can cultivate more virtue in myself versus folding in deeper levels, our affect, and really becoming much more whole and expanded versus where I think there might be a dogleg turn somewhere in the culture, especially maybe in American culture, because that's the one I more or less am familiar with, of the dogleg turn is I'm an individual, and my individual nature and my individual wants and my individual proclivities, I'm entitled to that. And that bypasses the depths that our psychoanalytic profession can help people access. So how do we put all that together?
Come on, John.
Simple question.
Yeah, when are you going to get to the tough ones? But in any case, I think I have found that this language, which may sound highfalutin, but it actually takes root very well.
Which language?
I use the word like a cultivation. I'll use the word virtue at times. And even though it's not, you might think that it sounds like overly academic or something. And I don't know, maybe it is, but all it takes is a little bit of illustration of what one is talking about there. That to become excellent as a human being, that may be a little bit abstract. But if you say, well, what we're talking about is how do you function in a civilization that partially works in your favor and partially doesn't?
Yeah. And you have control over some things and you don't have control over others, right?
So that learning enough self-mastery in the sense of understanding how it is that your psyche works, what would work in its favor, what not, how do I adapt in a maladapted society without losing the sense of my own expansiveness, my own individuation, my own contact with myself. Those are all things where you don't have to use the language of virtue theory, but I think the ideas that are there are crucial. And as you said, cultivation is a good word. I mean, it's a word that's not used that much in contemporary American English, so it's actually helpful because everybody kind of knows what it means, but they're not assuming, however it's used in popular media or something. It's just really not a common word, and yet cultivation is the best, right? And of course, the word that cult comes from, right? Or that rather cult, it comes from the word cult, right? So it's the idea that you honor the divine by cultivating, these aspects of yourself, the divine spark in you or the self.
So you're talking about self-mastery, which again, I think is if I'm not mistaken, that's a very much a Stoic idea, right? And so I'm always interested in how we can describe these very abstruse processes that we talk about in psychoanalysis. So let me take a swing at this, okay? Because I have this idea about what individuation looks like when it's operationalized. And I think it might relate to this idea about kind of mastery and cultivation. So this is my take on it. So we all kind of come to adulthood with a certain repertoire kind of behavioral responses. Like when we're angry, we do this. When we're tired, we do this. We just have a pretty narrow range of ways that we respond to situations. And as we grow, we can begin to develop other capacities. And that's the idea, in part, of individuation, of kind of becoming whole. So, for example, if you always deal with anger by shutting down because you're not very good at expressing it, part of becoming whole might be developing your ability to say, that's not okay with me, right? And then there's this idea that I think was expressed really well by, can't remember which psychoanalyst, talks about like the purpose is to insert a pause between the stimulus and the response. So if you've developed a full range of capacities now, you have the capacity to be angry, you have the capacity to sit back and chill, you have the capacity to do all these different things, dozens and dozens of things. And then you have that self-mastery to wait a beat. And then there's ethics. Because you think, it's two things. One is adaptation. Like, what's most likely? Let's say your boss does something that really pisses you off. Part of it's the question of what is most likely to get a good response out of this. Should I come back at him and scream? Probably not the best way.
Oh,
now you're telling me.
Or should I do something else? But and then there's the ethics. What's kind of the right thing to do? I could be very manipulative in this situation, or I could choose to take the high road or whatever. You've lifted up something so important because we always are talking about the unconscious, but Jung too felt that a strong ego was really important.
Mhm.
The point is not to get rid of the ego. The point is to strengthen the ego so that it can both navigate the outside world and relate to the inner world in this way that's effective. And it does produce like more adaptive responses, actually. So I don't know. How'd I do?
Good job.
Do I get an A? Because I definitely feel
Well,
like
I give A's only very rarely. I think that's great. Though I did use the word self-mastery there. I actually prefer the word self-management.
Yeah, I like that.
That's really good.
That's perfect.
I think self-mastery often, or self-control, has more of a defensive dimension to it. But self-management is saying, look, I want my anger to be functional, and I also don't want it to get out of hand. But I'm not going to say, oh, because it'll get out of hand, I'm not going to have it. Right. So it's as usual. It's the middle path here that's so characteristic of Jung. The equilibrium here between the extremes, and that to me is a managing, and it's a managing of a range, because in some situations it's more appropriate to be angry than others, and so forth. For example, but as you expand the capacity, you have both. It becomes more adaptive in the sense that it can function in the world and simultaneously serve your expansion. And it's the two together that you want to have. And that's also the way that the tradition of virtue was understood. I'm both at the service of others. For example, I'm doing good for others, but I'm becoming good through doing good at the same time.
Can I give a personal example of that? My favorite Stoic in my life, I think, although I don't think he would think of himself necessarily as a Stoic, is my father. And my mother had dementia. And my father's always been that kind of guy who was really into self-management, and he was a pretty straight arrow. And when my mother got sick, he devoted himself unfailingly to her care. And he took such good care of her and was so kind of measured about it. He wasn't, a martyr about it. He would call me and say, what do you think I should do? And we'd talk about it, and we'd talk through the different options. And he always tried to make the sensible, is it time to get someone to come in and help? But it was his mission to care for her. And I think, John, as per your point, I mean, he was definitely in service to her, but I think he felt really good about it. When she did die, he was devastated. But I remember talking to him about it, and he, sort of, how's the grieving process going? He said, I'm okay, because I did what I needed to do. And then he waited a few years because he didn't make any big decisions right away. But then he made this decision to move out of the house and into a community. His decision. He got there. Oh, this makes me just choke up. He got there, and he called me about a week to 10 days later. He goes, Lisa, I think I'm getting depressed. He said, everyone here just talks about their health problems. And I was like, oh, Dad, you don't have to stay there. Let's think about other options, And then about a week later, I called him. He goes, I just had the best dinner last night. I met these really great people. And within a month or two, I mean, he was producing a TV show. He joined the philosophy club. And I said, you're happy there? He goes, because I decided to be.
Lovely.
And he is having a blast. I mean, I can't get him on the phone because he's always busy, but, and just doing all kinds of wonderful things. He's learned to play bridge, and anyway, it's just great. But he is doing the right thing. He is in service to other people. He really wants to not be a burden to me and my sister. He's very aware of that, but he's also having a great time. So, yeah.
That, I think, is a really wonderful and very illustrative story about what are we talking about, about self-management and cultivation of our own inner resources in the service of someone else, in the service of our own expansion. How do we operationalize all that?
So it's a good question, and usually I think it's important to have what I would call a narrative about what your life means. The potential of our psyche is to become virtually anything. But the point is to focus it in such a way that you have a definite enough set of purposes in your life that are also expansive to you. You can't become everything, but ultimately people become nothing.
Yeah. Wow. Now, is that a Stoic idea, or is that a John White idea, or is that a Jung idea, or all three?
Well, I think you find it in various places in the tradition. There's a lot of ways where Aristotle's discussion of ethics is very much like that. Virtue, he thinks the virtue of excellence of human nature, but it's also about if you're a shipbuilder, you need the excellence of a shipbuilder, right? So he's getting a narrative story about what you feel like your purpose is, where even if he doesn't go into a lot of detail about that. But I think a lot of literature is about this, and it's about finding a definite purpose where people move from not knowing what they're about to knowing what they're about. And once that is articulated, they can begin to harness the full range of their potential, or at least the substantial part of their potential in some way. And I would also say, of course, Jungian psychoanalysis, I mean, certainly about that. You have to be able to tell a narrative about what your life means, and it's all right to be one that you're revising, but it's not all right not to have one. And if you begin to articulate what that is, then you are kind of marshaling the various resources that you have towards some purpose. So they are being activated, and you are learning adaptation, and you're learning how to struggle with difficulties and so forth. But my experience, clinically even, is that many people are anxious in part because their talents aren't being used. They can't tell a story about what that happens, and they get that sort of, you know what I mean, by antsy anxiety, where you can almost see in their body this sort of antsiness. And then a lot of it is because there's, I think, an impulsion on the part of certain talents or abilities that want to be activated in some way. But for some reason, they can't imagine a narrative in which those things are being activated.
That takes me to thinking about, these words like purpose and narrative and meaning of, how do we do that? And it takes me back to the idea of cultivation and your father, Lisa, of cultivation. You get up in the morning and you grab your hoe and you go out to the field, and plant by plant by plant by plant, you loosen the soil around, let's say, the corn. Your father, Lisa, got up in the morning and, let's say, made breakfast for your mother and made sure she was set for the day. When things changed, he talked to you, he talked to other people about what's the best way to handle this, of that there's something about the doing of what the day asks you simply to do that can help us find that narrative so that it's not some sort of magical mystery tour.
So maybe this would be the right place to read this very famous passage from Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So these were, and John, please jump in. The Meditations, it was basically a kind of a journal, basically, that he kept when he was campaigning out there near current day Vienna, who were attacking Rome. Okay, so he's, sleeping in a tent, bivouacked somewhere. And he writes, "At first day's light, have in readiness against disinclination to leave your bed the thought that I am rising for the work of man. Must I grumble at setting out to do what I was born for, and for the sake of which I have been brought into the world? Is this the purpose of my creation? To lie here under the blankets and keep myself warm?" So he's really, chiding himself, get out of bed and do what you came here to do, which I think is exactly what you were just talking about, Deb.
Yeah.
The sense of having a greater purpose somehow, even if it's just making breakfast for someone else.
Yes.
And just realizing that that's what needs to be done, which I think it's so interesting to talk about this in terms of a psychoanalysis or Jung, because in a certain sense, our work is all about really plumbing the unconscious, not so much on the surface of ego management, like get out of bed. But those two things are related, aren't they? And we certainly have people coming into our offices who need to plumb the unconscious, but frankly also need to get out of bed.
Yes.
Right?
Oftentimes that's the bigger obstacle at that moment, I think, right? But see, I think this may seem out of line in some ways. To me, you have to have a narrative, but a narrative has to come from an imagination. And I think imagination is highly shut down. And part of the reason why it's shut down is because screens and advertising and so forth are basically colonizing the imagination.
Yeah.
And so instead of people actually imagining what would be a narrative that would work for me, realizing that it's not an easy thing and that you're not going to come out with the end-all be-all story in your first stab. But I think there's a real closing in of imagination and a kind of general dissociated state of just receiving. Imagination has become passive because we receive things through our imagination all the time, primarily on screens. And the advertising industry, of course, works that way. I mean, that's demonstrable that they work to the subconscious mind, speaking in terms of affect and image. And so they can colonize, what's going on. And so we don't have a spontaneous imagination that helps us to understand what are possibilities that we could have. And how could I tell a story of my life that shows me that this could be a purpose and these would be the steps that I would take that and that I would maybe even love doing that. I think a lot of that is shut down. I don't know if your experience is similar, but I find that very frequently.
The loss of the self-reflective capacity with which Stoicism seems to have begun, which is we start thinking about thinking, but if it all just comes in at us through media, it bypasses that function.
Yes, I think that's right. A lot of patients I noticed have a certain amount of fantasy life, but not creative imagination.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like this could be a whole other episode to talk about the creative imagination. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I would love, let's expand on that at least a little bit of what are we talking about with creative imagination?
What I mean is the capacity to really, in a robust way, imagine possibilities as if they're actuality.
Mm-hmm.
If I can't do that, the likelihood of me changing anything in the stream of my life is very limited, right?
Totally.
So, and I do think that much of media plays off that. So, you're getting lifestyle with the rich and famous, you're getting celebrities, you're getting that kind of thing. But you're not getting much that's food for creative imagination. How would I go from here to there? Why would I want to go there? How could I imagine being there? What would that actually look like for me? What would it feel like? Imagination is key to this, I believe. I really believe that the imagination is the workshop, of possibility.
Oh, I love that. Imagination is the workshop of possibility. I totally agree with you. And I feel like, first of all, it's very difficult to do something if you haven't imagined doing it first. And if you have something difficult to do, try imagining it as vividly as you can, and it will be easier. And John, I have people who come in who say, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. And they have that kind of energy. And I feel like, their talent's pressing to come forward. And I say, well, sometimes I'll invite people say, well, imagine what kind of life would you like in 5 or 10 years? And some people can, I can, and they can really picture, but a lot of people can't. And they'll shut themselves down. And I'll say, no, first let yourself have the fantasy. And I'll say, what is the fantasy? And they're all embarrassed. I'm like, no, tell me, you're dancing on a rooftop in Ibiza. Go ahead, go there. Really let yourself have the fantasy. And then, yes, eventually there will be the compromise with reality. And what's the version of that you can have? But you've got to have the fantasy first. So I really agree very much with that.
And that's also very bound up with the feeling function, as we were talking about earlier, right? Because the fantasy or the imagination is bearing the values, right? So that's what the feeling function is trying to express also through that. I noticed that when I ask someone to imagine it, oftentimes they could still only do it like it's an intellectual, like they don't get their feeling involved.
Yeah.
But without the feeling of it, you're not really fully imagining it. Like you say, it's not the vivid kind of imagining that you're looking at. But if you can do that, I not only think that it gives you a sense of possibility, but if you keep imagining yourself in that situation, often certain abilities that are latent begin to develop so that you can actually do it.
You're cultivating them.
Cultivating. It's exactly what you're doing. Yeah, as you read that a lot about people who have been very successful in life, they often have a very robust creative imagination. and often imagine themselves in that situation. And by imagining it, it's as if psyche responds by saying, "Oh, that's what you want? Well, look, let's start developing this. Let's start developing that."
I feel like we're treading dangerously close to what is that called? That manifesting.
Yes, the New Thought tradition and things like that. That's right. Yeah.
But in a way, is one of the possibilities, is that it's sort of a magical thinking thing. And I can waft off into some sort of fantasy of there above, the bluebirds sing, versus the depths of yourself and the rest of yourself. Where I'm thinking about this is the parallel with active imagination, of connecting with your own inner ability to have feeling and to let the unconscious speak while you have a dialogue with it. So you sort of immerse yourself in something in your own interior that is also real. So you're going in and deep, not out and away. And that is very much at the heart of Jungian analysis anyway, is what's our relationship with the unconscious, with psyche?
And I think what you're saying also really increases agency, which is also associated with the Stoics.
Yes.
Right. So that, because it's when you can have that kind of connectedness to your own potential, and then imagine it also becoming realized in the outer world, that then, of course, your agency is also activated.
So it's the both and, right?
Yes.
It's the feeling and the creative imagination coupled with the sense of agency and I want to say like responsibility. So here's a quote from Jung that I think of as kind of, stoic-like. He says, "Life calls us forth to independence, and anyone who does not heed this call because of childhood laziness or timidity is threatened with neurosis," which is what you're talking about, John, when people come into the office and they have their antsy. And once this has broken out, it becomes an increasingly valid reason for running away from life and remaining forever in the morally poisonous atmosphere of infancy. So that's super interesting because once you feel neurotic, once you're like, "Oh, I'm anxious," then you're literally like, "Oh my God, I can't do anything because I'm anxious." And we see so many people like that who are suffering because they can't get out in life and do what they want to do because they're anxious. And really, it's almost like, well, if you could just make a move, you might be less anxious.
Well, that's right. That's right. It's understanding those kinds of things as indications of, rather than just trying to avoid the anxiety, figure out what the anxiety is telling you.
Yeah.
That so often happens with those feelings that are uncomfortable, whether it's grief, whether it's anxiety, whether it's, feelings of shame, how often someone just sort of punishes themselves because they're feeling shame. Well, that's not really the function of shame. Shame's trying to tell you something. And it's as if, yes, you're taking anxiety seriously insofar as it limits you, but not insofar as telling you something,
Right.
which is really what the anxiety is for. It is part of its own adaptive thing. It's trying to say, you got to do something with this talent. Otherwise, you're just going to remain anxious. Not, well, I can't work it because I'm anxious. The other way around, the anxiety is telling you need to.
We started off by saying, gosh, this is really so up in the culture. There are podcasts. There are all kinds of, there's an Instagram page. There's there's the Daily Stoic. I forget what that is. And if you look, I will shamefacedly admit that I'm somewhat obsessed with the Amazon bestseller ranks. But I will tell you that Marcus Aurelius is like, I don't know what it is today, but it's usually like number 600 out of all the like millions of books on Amazon. And I think it's pretty much been a bestseller since it was published, but especially now, it's very, very apropos. And I think, and I said in the beginning, I think it's compensatory. I think in this culture now, we get messages that, oh, you're anxious. Well, here's a pill, and maybe don't take that class if it makes you anxious. Oh, you're anxious. Oh, then here's a what do they call those things where, if you're in high school, you get a special education plan. If you're anxious, don't go to class. Go to the nurse's office. You can lie down. There's been a kind of cultivation of fragility, actually, in some of the ways that our culture has responded. This whole idea about trigger warnings, which have now been shown to be actually unhelpful. It's like, well, no, maybe you need to, pull yourself up a little bit and do something difficult which I think, as per that Marcus Aurelius quote, it's like that is what Stoicism urges us to do. And it's what Jung urges us to do as well. It's like figure out what you need to do and then bloody well figure out how to do it.
And the good news is really it is so empowering. You have the power. You have the power. It's right there in you, a little bit like Dorothy in the red shoes. Go for it. Come on. You can. Have a life.
Instead of looking at the obstacles to your agency, look at how your agency can overcome the obstacles, how much better that you feel about yourself when you can.
Yeah, and when we do better, we feel better.
So what have we not hit here, John, in terms of Stoicism or its link with Jung? Did we miss anything?
There's a way where a classical psychoanalysis and Stoicism are kind of opposites, like insofar as, original psychoanalysis was in large measure a reaction against industrial society where instincts and affects were to be suppressed because you're supposed to be working in the industrial machine, right? And so I'm not even sure if there hadn't been industrial society, a psychoanalysis would have actually been necessary. But in any case, Stoicism is instead saying, control them. Sometimes it's maybe overly strong about them. Sometimes maybe it treats instincts and feeling life too much of the same, that they're all problems, and so just be very rational. But as you're saying, there is something compensatory about it in an age where people's affects just seem to be vomited out all over the place. And it's such a chaos of affective life because of this problem of uncultivated affective life. When it's not cultivated, then it has a way of just projecting itself into the world, and people are just trying to react against it. So I also see this increase in Stoicism in the last 15 years or so as being partially a reaction against that, which increased, I think, during the pandemic. I think when people didn't know what to do with themselves, to read meditations, for example, was actually kind of consoling to figure out and got to kind of keep doing that. But what I think you both have highlighted, what's really key there is that the kind of responsibility we have for our inner life is very central to Stoicism. I wouldn't necessarily limit that to rationality because, as I've said, I think the language of cultivation tells you cultivate your abilities and your powers and so forth. Includes your capacity for feeling and relating to values. That's a hard thing to do in a consumer capitalist society where there is no such thing as value. It's just whatever you want. And I shouldn't have to, make myself any different for it. So that's kind of a hard lesson. So part of this compensatory move of Stoicism is serving a good purpose. Some of it maybe not, because it could be saying, yeah, your feeling life doesn't matter. Your instincts don't matter. Well, that's not, I think, the right point either. So it has maybe an ambiguous relationship to psychoanalysis, and certainly in highlighting responsibility for inner life. That I think is crucial. But inner life is more than rationality. But honestly, in our society, if you cultivate that, you're already on a good track.
Right.
The capacity to take a little distance from one's emotional life so that you can't cultivate it if you can't learn how to take that space between your feeling and interpreting what it means and so forth. That classical psychoanalytic idea that you have kind of three options of your affective life: repress it, act it out, or learn how to contain it so that it symbolizes. That's not exactly Stoic, but there is something that resonates with the Stoic thing where I learned to neither repress, which maybe a negative Stoicism would do, or just kind of vomiting out that I'm saying I think is all too frequent. And understanding there's something kind of in between that, which is enough management of yourself so that you don't spit it out. Management and not control. So you're not trying to repress it and not let it have a voice. You're trying to figure out how to have it let a voice that's actually fruitful.
Right. Feelings are information.
Yes, exactly.
And so they tell us something. The next step is, what do I do with that information? How do I reflect on it, turn it over in my own mind, and decide how to use it, how to put it to use one way or another, versus I'm identified with my feelings. So to go back to something you said earlier, Lisa, if I'm mad at my boss, absolutely walk right in there and start screaming. After all, I have a feeling.
Yeah, don't do that.
Oh, don't do that.
No, try that at home.
But how to use all that we have and all that we are.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. I wouldn't say that Stoicism says this, but you could take it as an implication that you have to learn how to love your inner life. So even if we don't draw that just from Stoicism, which might be ambivalent with relation to that, I think it's something we need to draw probably from what we've talked about today. If you learn to love your inner life, you learn to cultivate it. If you're not trying to cultivate it, you're probably not loving it. You're probably trying to escape from it or something else is coming up.
I really, really like that as a sort of a compass of what do you love? What goes on in you that you enjoy about yourself, that you love, that you find interesting, good, remarkable, beautiful, of orient to yourself with a feeling of love.
I think like Jung said, the face should turn to the unconscious, the unconscious turns to you. So the more you do that, the more I think, even when you run into those inner obstacles, which is so much a part of that second half of analysis Jung talks about, when your adaptation's not so much to outer life, but to your own psychic structure, if you don't gain a love for that inner life, you're not going to go very far down that path.
Today's dreamer is a man. He is 60 years old, and he is in academic publishing and sales. And the name of his dream is the Diamond Bicycle. And here's the dream. I'm on foot, waiting at a traffic light on a sunny day with a bunch of pedestrians and cyclists to cross a busy London street near Westminster. The light changes, and as the crowd in front of me moves, I discover a gorgeous bicycle in front of me. I look around, and an old woman next to me says, "Yes, that's right, someone forgot it." I take the bike a few meters away to a less crowded, grassy area. The bicycle is glistening silver, and it sparkles with countless embedded diamonds. There's a huge front wheel and a small back wheel, and the whole thing folds up neatly for easy carrying. I know this bike is the absolutely A1 highest quality, top-of-the-line bike anyone could own, a real luxury item. Some of the diamonds spell the name of the owner, along with a warning that the bike is equipped with a tracking device. I decide to take it home anyway, so I can further examine it, perhaps find out how to contact the owner and then call them. We only have landlines in the world of the dream. I unfold the bike into a standing foot scooter, a few pushes from my feet, and I'm off on an exhilarating journey. With no more effort from me, the bicycle scooter speeds along sidewalks while I deftly weave in and out of people's way with a breeze in my hair. At one point, I'm rushing along a passageway resembling an airport concourse beneath Westminster. When I arrive home, I explain to my partner what's happened, and it's then I discover a backpack strapped to the bike, which contains a pair of black jeans with a wallet in a front pocket. When I open the wallet, I discover an ID, along with a huge wad of cash. Instantly, I start counting. I discard the few bills that enwrap the bundle as they are Deutschmarks. Instead, I count the wad of 20-pound notes, amazed at how much money there is, secretly hoping my partner will tell me to keep it, the bike, and the cash. And I know I will, too. All I need is a nudge, which she might just give me. And for associations, he says, my partner and I are very busy and never seem to have much time to enjoy life. We both start work very early, and our free time is taken up with the stress and details of purchasing our first house together. It's an exciting change, but we also don't want to leave the arty little town where we've been renting for the last 5 years. But rising rents and high house prices are driving us out. We're both artists. I'm also a writer, and have found an edgy and nurturing art scene here. The main feelings in the dream, he says, at first was confusion, then excitement, exhilaration, and temptation. And he adds, I've lived in London for 25 years, but moved away to my current location in the UK countryside about 6 years ago. The sparkly silver reminds me of classic 60s drum kits. I was born into a drumming family on my mom's side, and it was always a safe space for me to play drums. I played in rock bands and throughout the late 80s to the late 90s in both the US and the UK. So, okay, what can we make of this dream?
It's such a lovely dream, isn't it?
So many images, so much nuance to them as well.
We could start with the location. It's funny, though, I found myself, Westminster's mentioned a couple of times, and I found myself wondering about that particular location. There's Westminster, the seat of government, and then there's Westminster Abbey, and there's, Westminster being an area of London. And I was just thinking about all of that and wondering if there's a particular resonance, but I don't know if there is or not. So it's a little hard for me to do that, but it seems very specific that it's about Westminster. So I don't know, but we could talk about diamonds because this is an archetype. The diamond is an archetype, and it is something, I think it's the hardest, isn't it? The hardest substance on earth.
I think so.
So there's something eternal about a diamond. Doesn't rust or change shape, or it, in some sense, it really is therefore an image of something like soul, that it's everlasting, that it's inviolable.
I'm in a slightly different place, perhaps.
Okay.
Here our dreamer, our dream ego, comes across this wonderful, wonderful bicycle. It's sparkly and it folds up and it's got diamonds in it. And it sounds, what a great thing to sort of ride home on this kind of magical bike. And then, as if that's not enough, there's a backpack with plenty of money in it. And so more and more good fortune befalls our dreamer. And then the intention of the dream ego kind of goes from, I'm going to get it home, but then I'll contact the owner, to, hey, wait a minute. Maybe I could just, if my partner gives me a little nudge, just go ahead and keep it.
So there are kind of two potential references to the anima in this dream. The first is the woman who says, that's right. What does she say? The woman that encourages him to take.
Yeah, somebody left it here.
Yeah, she says somebody left it here. So the first woman in the dream kind of encourages him to take it in a sense. She doesn't say that, but that's the sense, like, yeah, someone forgot it. And then he's hoping that his partner will say, yeah, keep it. What I imagine about this, because I think oftentimes in dreams where we dream of stealing something, it's an image of a part of us reaching for something that feels like it's kind of transgressive. So, for example, maybe having fun. He says, we don't have a lot of time for fun in his context. And here he's riding this home and the wind is in his hair. It's kind of exhilarating. And it's almost like the anima saying, go ahead. It's okay. You can claim it. My fantasy the whole time, and this is often the way it is in dreams, is like the owner is the name is written in diamonds on the side of the bike, and he's going to contact the owner. It's like, I think what you need to get in contact with is a part of yourself.
I thought of a fairy tale, and the fairy tale is Jack and the Beanstalk.
Mm-hmm.
And Jack makes the dumbest trade in all of human history, where he trades or sells the cow for a handful of beans. And his mother is so mad at such a dumb deal that she throws him out the window and up he goes. And there, the giant's wife, up there at the top of the beanstalk, helps him. She hides him, and I forget all the treasures he comes back down with, but one of them is a magic harp, and I think another
There's a goose that lays a golden egg, and there's something else too, yeah.
And so I'm wondering if this woman at the beginning of the dream, like you mentioned, Lisa, who says, yeah, that's right, someone forgot it, is kind of tipping her hat to, yeah, it's there for the taking. And that the transgressive thing is actually in service of the psyche.
Exactly.
Right. And that's also, I think, clear from the fact that at the beginning he's with a group, pedestrian and so forth, and he takes it and takes off with it. It's like a movement toward individuation.
Oh,
It's
I
right
like
in
that.
moving
Yeah.
from the collective to the individual. And I also felt that transgressive part of it was crucial about, we don't know what the name says actually. Maybe it's actually yours. If that maybe that it is the transgression, it's the boldness that will allow you to do that. But if you have the boldness to do it, that you can reap the fruits of it.
I was curious about the Deutschmarks. Sometimes these little details in dreams can be so eloquent. Now, of course, we don't know because we don't know what Deutschmark might mean to this dreamer, but it's interesting because there's some kind of currency that doesn't matter on the outside, but then there are all these 20-pound notes, inside. So, if I had the dreamer here, I'd say Deutschmarks, tell me about Deutschmarks, tell me about Germany, it's German, I don't know. But we could sort of have a fantasy about what that might mean. But it does seem like he's getting closer and closer to the thing. And I think per your point, John, which I just love, this is something that takes you places. This is a bike. It's going to take you someplace. So you can travel on it.
Yeah, so it's an agency symbol there, right? And it's just, again, it's more the courage, the boldness to take it, see what happens. Yeah.
I'm also thinking it relates to what he said about the drumming that he was so involved in, and he was born into a drumming family, and how drums have all that sparkly silver. And what would it feel like to be able to just play music and drum and express yourself in this way that let loose? I wonder, there's some parallels in the dream. Take it, ride it, get those drumsticks, let loose.
Yeah, it feels like a really auspicious dream. It feels like an invitation or even an exhortation to take hold of something that feels like maybe doesn't belong to you. And there's a really nice relationship with the anima implied because it's like, yeah, the anima is going to say, do it, And that seems to be reflected in his outer world partnership as well, that she wants him to do it too. It seems like a lovely dream. Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.